All right, good afternoon. My name is Garrett Matthews. This is my audience. Thank you. All right, so our projector broke, so we're going to try and work the best we can with this. Hopefully my audience can at least see it, but I don't think the camera will. So I said my name is Garrett Matthews. I'm a licensed critical care paramedic. This class is going to cover early recognition of stroke. Basically, what is it? How does it work? What are the different types of stroke? And then what do we do to recognize it and prevent it? So UCLA is one of the premier stroke centers in the nation, and this is how they define stroke. Stroke is also called a brain attack. Occurs when a blood flow to the brain is disrupted. Disruption in blood flow is caused when either a blood clot or a piece of plaque blocks one of the vital vessels in the brain, which we call an ischemic stroke, or when a blood vessel in the brain bursts, spilling blood into the surrounding tissues, or a hemorrhagic stroke. One of the things that's important to note about the hemorrhagic stroke is that blood, anywhere that it's not normally meant to be, is extremely irritating to everything that it touches. So if we have blood that's not inside of a blood vessel, any tissue that comes in contact with it ends up causing extreme tissue damage or just basically a lot of irritation to that tissue. So by the numbers, 2014, cause of death for over 130,000 Americans, which was about 1 in every 20 people. On average, someone suffers a stroke every 4 minutes, and that includes everything from what we also call a transient ischemic attack, which is a temporary sign of a stroke. So we'll go into a little bit further, but that would be a piece of plaque goes into an artery where it can't pass. Everything past that plaque suffers from lack of oxygenated blood, but then that piece of plaque ends up being able to move. Oxygenated blood then goes back to that tissue, so we saw symptoms for just a moment. Also, it costs $34 billion per year. That includes everything from pre-hospital care, hospitalization, and then treatments afterwards. And lastly, it's the leading cause of long-term serious disability. So what makes us more likely to have a stroke? Atrial fibrillation is a very common thing that we see in all kinds of people. And to explain atrial fibrillation, that is essentially when the heart beats irregularly. And that one's actually more specific to the top part of the heart. So why does that matter? Because when the heart doesn't beat in a normal pattern, blood is allowed to accumulate in one of the chambers. When it accumulates, it coagulates together. Eventually that will be ejected through the heart to somewhere in the body. Well, now that's a solid mass that's going to go through the blood vessels to a point where it cannot pass. Higher blood pressure. So we've got to look at the body as a whole system. Even though stroke is primarily with the brain, the high blood pressure causes the arteries which supply the brain, which supply the heart, to work harder. They end up being shrunk down, so that in a sense is plaque. Higher pressures, higher chance of it sending out a piece of debris through the arteries. Diabetes, poor health of the arteries mixed with obesity. One of the conditions that diabetics suffer is a condition called diabetic ketoacidosis. That is, when you look at it in a chemistry form, is actually the same compound that women use to remove nail polish from their nails. It's a very, very acidic compound. If you can imagine just how devastating that could be through your arteries. Also, we know that diabetes tend to be obese because of the struggles they have between sugar and being able to use that sugar. Well, that goes back to higher blood pressure. Also, cigarette smoking, which has kind of been something that medicine has found more recently, has been a leading factor of stroke. Going back to the idea that the body is a whole system. Even though smoking we think of just damage to the lungs work with the heart works with the brain. So when you start damaging certain body systems, other ones have to compensate. So who's our risk factors? At least the ones that we cannot control. Race. Statistically, African Americans suffer more because of a condition called sickle cell anemia. And if you imagine that a red blood cell is a disc, sickle cell anemia is when that disc has sharp edges on it. So as it travels through the arteries, it's in a sense scraping along, causing damage to everything that it touches. Also, they statistically have higher numbers of people who suffer high blood pressure and diabetes. Gender, 55,000 women suffer strokes more than men per year. Also, they found that oral contraceptives affect the likelihood of having strokes, just the way that it affects the blood. If you've had a previous stroke, you are 10 times more likely to have a stroke. That's actually by year too. That's keeping in mind everything from a transient ischemic attack, which we talked about a second ago, to a full-blown hemorrhagic stroke. And then age, 55 years or older, we start to see higher incidence of stroke. So if we take a look at how this works, the brain is fed by the internal and external carotid arteries, noted here. As it travels up, it hits an area which is going to be a key point to remember in this, and that's an area called the Circle of Willis, named after Dr. Willis. Why does that point matter? Because as plaque travels up, the symptoms that we're going to see are determined by which part of the Circle of Willis it happens. Case in point, if a plaque forms towards the front of the brain, we understand that the front of the brain is responsible for personality, for your short-term memory, things of that nature. So when you have somebody who's not acting right, maybe a telltale sign. If it travels to the left or right side of the brain, well, that's in charge of what we call proprioception, or basically your understanding of distance. So what would that look like to somebody? Family members sitting at a breakfast table. They're drinking their coffee, they're having breakfast. Very simple, what might not be ordinarily something you would think of, but they go to reach for their coffee cup and knock it over. Well, that's a process that we don't normally think of, but for them, because that part of the brain is going without oxygenated blood, is now suffering, now it's not working properly, so you're going to see changes in that. And then probably the most important part would be the back of the brain. That's when we're going to see differences in heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing, whether that's the rate or depth, things of that nature. That's a very serious area to be affected. So if we look a little bit closer between the difference between a hemorrhagic and an ischemic stroke, this is what the difference would look like. If you kind of zoom in on the arteries, like I mentioned earlier, a plaque would come up through the internal or external carotid arteries, and in an ischemic one, basically it's going to a point where it narrows down where it cannot pass. Now with a hemorrhagic stroke, blood vessels aren't exactly what we think of as just a single layer tissue. They're actually multiple layers. So if you were able to look at one before it burst, you would see that it has a balloon type effect, and it's just causing increased pressure to the point where it finally expands and explodes. And like I said earlier, blood being where it doesn't belong, extremely irritating. So the effects of the stroke, these are very common signs that we see. Slurred speech, unilateral weakness, loss of perception of and orientation to surroundings, memory problems, and behavioral changes. The American Heart Association has probably been the leading organization to take on the awareness and treatment of stroke. They came up with an acronym called FAST, which is facial drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, and time to call 911. Very simple, easy way to remember what the symptoms are and what you should do. Lastly, prevention. What do we do in order to prevent stroke? Eating a healthy diet. That goes back to combat high blood pressure and obesity. Maintaining a healthy weight. Obesity causes plaque within the arteries, something that's very damaging and very likely that you're going to cause a stroke. Getting enough exercise, keeping your body healthy, not smoking, and limiting alcohol use. So that's kind of the very broad spectrum of what stroke is. I hope that you got something out of my presentation today. Thank you for your time.